Hey, welcome back. You have landed in the process, Dr. John Bush. We are trying to help you win your fantasy football drafts because about 60% of your show is from your drafts. So we hope that this will lead to win your league. I will be doing in-season articles at fakepigskin.com. So come and join me. We may be doing video uh, metric discussions instead of just traditional articles here. Anyway, this is lesson 13. I have so much data and so little time. I'm going to focus on age analysis. It's just kind of one of the things that I start off with. There's no rhyme or reason to the reason I start off. This is part one, and we will go through some aspects. Again, my process is to try to develop some reference classes that we can use to forecast our success in 2021 or other seasons, depending if I ever get around to updating this. And age is one factor, especially if you're a dynasty person. I know you're hyper sensitive to dynasty fantasy football here. So let's dig into the data and see what we can determine, if anything, right? Uh, just an overall view. My database runs from '02 to last year, 2020, and the average age of players in my database, quarterbacks, tight ends, wide receivers, running backs, has dropped almost a year, about 8 months younger. Uh, Variations dropped as well. So, in other words, we're getting a lot of more younger players, and more players are younger versus in the, shall we say, older days. Players were a little older, and there was a little bit more variation in those populations. So people are saying, look at age and whatnot. So everybody's focused on age, but all the players are getting younger, right? So I think then we go to the extremes? In other words, how young is something to really make note of? So it just makes sense. Age of players is dropping. People are focusing on age, but the average is dropping. So more players are closer to 26 than they were to 27 18 years ago. So if you look at a trend line, we can see here, this is a polynomial trend line that's pretty clear. Looking at the data points, it's dropped. Variation has dropped as well. Okay, if you look at kind of a line here, variation, we're dropped here. So we're getting players that are younger, and there's a whole bunch more of them closer together. So is that just kind of a self-fulfilling thing that they're more drafting, or they're leaving college earlier, or, you know, not quite 100% sure what the cause of that is, but it clearly is the data. So what about positional ages? Has that changed over 18 years? I've got some tabular data above: quarterbacks, tight ends, running back, wide receivers. And clearly, the oldest players on the team are going to tend to be the quarterback, average age about 28. Tight ends are the next at 26.6. Then running backs and wide receivers are closer to the average age of 26. So there's something to be said. So when we say the average age of players is dropping, That's true probably except for tight ends and quarterbacks. So we're really focused on the running backs and wide receivers. The green metric here showing the quarterback, and we see this kind of pattern fairly straight, but there is a little bit of uptick here, but probably nothing significant. So being a little older is not something to be overly concerned about at all. Tight ends are next. Here's the blue line, and they're dropping a little bit. There's a little bit of a trend for a drop, but not something overly significant. But I see running backs, wide receivers, and running backs clearly are dropping, and that's the trend. So, is that running backs and wide receivers a little older? Are they being forced out of the league? Is that what's going on? Or are there more younger players joining, or a combination? It's kind of like a input output kind of thing, what's coming in, what's going out. But I think if there was a value to a young running back or wide receiver, it's less actually on average, right, than in the early years, right? Because they would have a little bit more stood out. Okay. Running backs were near the 26 mark, and now they're closer to 25, and wide receivers are even 25. So if you look at the overall average of 26, that's including this world here that we had older players. But if we look recently, clearly we're dropping almost a year, year and 3 months, 2 months, year and 1 month. So there's a premium now, but the variation says there's a lot more of them. So it's not like, wow, this is a young tight end, a young running back or wide receiver. So this is unusual. It's going to be, and I predict the run of the mill now. In fact, the issue then becomes the older, and do we get even more super sensitive to age? Because dynasty players for sure, probably not as much in redraft, but dynasty players, it's kind of like a hot potato. When do they get rid of their players on their team? Should you be a year early or a year late? There's always, you see that debate all the time on that aspect here. So if we parse age a little bit out here and we group age into sectors. So I arbitrarily grouped players 21 to 23, 24 to 26, 27 to 30, and 31 plus. And then I threw in the average fantasy points per game production on average. Now, this is, the bench warmers as well, just kind of a grand, kind of rough average. Pretty interesting that older quarterbacks are not at any disadvantage at all. Okay. They are producing 11.8 and definitely above average of 10.9. So 1 point per game, a superior older quarterback is earning you, right? Well, Brady, Breeze, Roethlisberger, some of these old dogs, they're producing. So don't be so scared of an older quarterback as long as they're, 2 legs, right? Running backs next. And I group this in kind of a tier that the next level of fantasy points per game. On average, running backs are producing less, 5.7. Again, this is looking at all the running backs own the team. Okay. We're not talking about the RB1. Okay. Same thing with wide receivers. They're producing on average 7. So just apples to apples here, wide receivers are producing more if you just pulled them out of a hat. Notice, though, this is the scary stat, and the reason dynasty players is kind of like they don't want to hold an old running back with a lot of miles. However, wide receivers, on the other hand, it's exact opposite. So you wonder if people are so hyper to the age, does their decision making stick to the position, or are they just worried, overly sensitive to age? I think with running backs, I think the data is saying yes. If they're, 31 and older, oh yeah, be concerned. But wide receivers, notice up to 26, they're really not peaking yet. Okay, so there's always this question in Dynasty, when are these players peaking? For running backs, it's probably, there's a group coming in, and we've seen the drafts, they're peaking right there. Some are getting a little seasoned and then peak at 27 to 30. So there's probably two populations. The hot shots coming in. Now, is that a self-fulfilling prophecy? But anyway, the hot shots coming in, they get show, they produce. Maybe they wear out quicker. I mean, what's the survivability of it? Is there a usage thing, snaps or apps? Do running backs play out based on the number of times they carry the ball? Data is not going to answer that, but it's definitely worth our investigating that. Wide receivers, however, you should not be overly concerned about seasoned wide receivers. On average, they can produce the best on average. Okay. Tight ends, clearly this mantra of young tight ends are not peaking, there's truth. Looks like 27 or so to 30, they're hitting their peak, and that can extend past 30, 31 plus. So some take homes, having younger tight ends and wide receivers versus a team that has older tight ends and wide receivers. Should we, and maybe in our summer analysis, once drafts and free agencies are settled, should we think about teams that have too many young wide receivers and tight ends? Is that an issue? The data might suggest yes. Teams that seem to have some older running backs, probably an issue. That doesn't seem positive to me based on just this simple metric. An older quarterback is not going to be an issue for me. So I think we'll leave this here, but think about teams and look at their age distribution and see if we can get some advantage here. I think there's something to that. Suggest you do a little research on that. Here's fantasy points versus age, just looking at the data, just grafted, right? Just the same table, but now just the just a graph of it. Just to me, I'm a visual player. This is what I'm seeing here. Okay, this is what I'm seeing. I'm circling the peaks for quarterbacks, for wide receivers, for running backs, and for tight ends. Clearly different. You cannot treat all positions the same. I don't think necessarily people are, but you really should not. So this slide shows data that I broke out from year sectors and age. So I wanted to tease out the data a little bit, see what we got here. So the first group of four is quarterback, year 2002 to 6, 2007 to 11, 2012 to 16, and then 2017 to 2020. And if we look at fantasy points per game on the average of the year sector, we can see that we are living in the best time in 18 years for quarterback fantasy point per game production. We're talking almost 2 points better per game than 2011. That's very significant. Look at 2012, something, and I probably need to go back and look at the rule switches or what happened in 2012 that we see such a change in the game, such a fundamental change. Not sure. I think we're just now appreciating, the value of the quarterbacks. What about running backs just overall? Kind of, we've been through a kind of a trough here, 6 down to 5.5, 5.5, and then back to 6. So we're at a pretty good time for running backs overall. And then tight ends, had a little down 4 years here, but pretty much we're close to 4. Interestingly enough, we and our wide receivers have dropped as a group. So, are there more wide receivers now in specialized roles than there were? Because remember, this just looks at all the players. One would think that, or have running backs been catching more lately? Could be. But something has clearly changed in the game from 7.57 to 6.2. So the value that wide receivers just blind average, not talking about necessarily wide receiver one, dropped. So we need to deal with that aspect. So that's kind of an overview. So let's go back into the sectors per age, and I think I'll focus on 2020. What we've seen is the rise of the young, new quarterback here. I think it's clear we know who we're talking about, and it's very clear. Whereas the old dogs pretty much are the old dogs, and they're still doing kind of their thing. But the big change is the younger quarterbacks are all of a sudden on the scene. So in 2002, it would have been hard if you were playing fantasy football to try to grab a young 23-year-old quarterback and expect a lot. Okay, so games have changed. So I think that to me is the biggest thing. Certainly things have increased overall, but I think the big increase is the young quarterback. So there's a lot of people saying that, but here's the data. So running backs, we also see the younger players are the best they've ever been as far as 21 to 26. Really, really good. I think there was a time when the older season running back 27 to 30, we might have thought was something that seems to have gone away now. Okay, we're not seeing that. The shift is to the younger. So by 26, even, so dynasty players always consider, when do running backs become stale? There's always that debate. Is it 26? There's some data that might suggest that. Okay, so I think that means running backs that are younger are going to be more at a premium. I think we've seen that in redraft. And I think that's going to, there's nothing that's going to change on that, folks. Folks are going for the, on average, are going for the running backs there. Tight ends, on the other hand, clearly you need seasoning. Okay? Need seasoning. What's interesting to me, and I probably don't have time, but if anybody listening, check that out. What was going on? Was there fewer wide receivers, maybe? And so tight ends were actually more important? Uh, I don't know. That's very intriguing. So I think seasoned tight ends are definitely where it's at. Wide receivers are a conundrum to me. Look at the drop in the last few years. Look at that. That is just not so good here. Maybe I'll do yellow here. Yeah. Look at that. Man, that's a drop. So again, do we have more wide receivers now? Do they have specialized wide receivers? Are there more 3 and 4 wide receiver sets? Do teams use more wide receivers now? I think probably so, but right now, just here's the data. Consider it. Uh, again, this is not the top group. This is just everybody. So you need to what the data can impart and what it cannot. You can't just take things. You've got to apply some common sense to the metrics. Okay, that's the final jump here. I just plotted these. Love three-dimensional bar graphs. And what I did for this is quarterbacks versus age. So age sectors and year sectors. Look at I highlighted the segment that was the top. So 27 to 30 was the top 2002 and 6, and was the top 2007 and 11, whereas the old dogs ruled in 12 to 16, and now the young dogs. That is such a flip. I mean, there was some evidence right here that it was beginning, but look how it just took off. In other words, the success breed more success. I think the old dogs are still holding on, but clearly these young phenoms are coming in. So you wonder, have we now lost the normal wave where quarterbacks would come up the ranks and then get good or get an opportunity? Maybe they were good at 27 to 30. Very intriguing, versus kind of this kind of a barbell situation here in the last few years, which is high here, low, and late. So then you start worried about the quarterbacks in the middle here. Just be aware. Running backs, same thing. Older running backs here, some age perked in there. There they are. And then kind of the older ones. So there's kind of flip flopping between the young and the more seasoned. But what we've seen is a complete skew to the younger running backs at this point. Okay, it's not even close now. Okay, very intriguing. And of course, people are not asleep, and that's going to drive in Dynasty and others the value uh, of these early players. So that means probably the draft picks for are going to be more valued in Dynasty because you're going to try to grab a running back. Tight ends, clearly it's the old seasoned dogs that really hasn't changed since 2012, but clearly it was something different back in the day. So, more wide receivers. Does that mean we now have teams have time for more seasoning on their tight ends? Curious to see where this goes. And wide receivers. Uh, old dogs here, '02 to '06. Old dogs there, old dogs there, and old dogs there. So there is a pattern that, with some exceptions, wide receivers that have had seasoning in years are not to be discarded. In fact, 27 to 30 to even 31 and up uh, have value, and you should be concerned about the younger wide receivers on average. I know there's always an exception, but on average, be a little more skeptical. And then, of course, the flip strategy for running backs. I looked at the years and just circled the top 3 or 4 in each group. And with quarterbacks, we've seen a resurgence here. Here are the top 3. Running backs was back in the heyday, tight ends, and wide receivers. So it was more these players' games back in the old days, versus now. And look at the drop over time. Okay. Very, very intriguing. And you can see over the years uh, what's going on with the quarterbacks and the wide receivers and the running backs over time, and you see the trends here uh, changing over the years. So this is percentage of the best. So I looked at 18 years and made the top at 100%. And then every other quarterback, running back, tight end, and wide receiver group was ranked in that area. And we see that we've had a real good run since for sure 2013. Had a bad year 2016, throw that out. And we've had some resurgence. Let me circle that. Some resurgence in running backs. Yes, I know there were the higher ones here, but in the 80s, 80th percentile, almost 90. So, they hadn't gone away. Tight ends certainly have changed, and I don't see a lot of change, really. Wide receivers as well. When's the last time we had this right here? 13 and 14. The rest of the time, we've had poor uh, wide receivers. If you look at 18 years there, very intriguing. really should stimulate us to think about questionings a little bit. But you know, I think we have to live in the now, and this is what we're seeing on average. Okay, so that was my 10-cent tour of the first part of age. Just kind of wet your whistle a little bit. Just there's some suggestions of some really interesting stats and questions that have come out of this data, and I've got a whole bunch, folks. It's crazy how much data I have. I just going to be knocking everybody's socks off here once this gets going and gets out. I'm really staying. Haven't advertised yet, but the metric people should really appreciate this. Hey, if not a lot of people show up and consume, then good for those that do. Okay, this is the process. This is another fun lesson. My name is Dr. Bush. Come back. We will continue our journeys. Lots of fun. Woo woo.